You put on a check.
Yes.
How he loves us.
Ellen's not here. Enough is
How
not
he
here.
loves
I'm not
us.
sure if Perryman.
How he loves us. He is jealous. He is jealous for me. Love's like a hurricane. I am a tree bending beneath the weight of his.
Boy, he perspired. Oh my gosh!
I know. Well, good morning. It still is morning, right? Glad that you're here on this cold, windy, rainy, spring day. Spring is coming. This This is the weekend that we spring forward. And I don't like that weekend. I like when we fall back. But we'll spring forward this weekend, and don't forget, it's always fun on church on Sunday to see people walking in and wondering what's going on. And I like to go up and say, which service did you think you were coming to? And they go, oh, is that today? So we're glad you're here. I hope there are a few live streaming. I didn't get that link out very, very quickly this week, but sounds like we have 3 people live streaming. Yeah, it's always on the Keys page, so you can always find the link. We're glad that we're able to use that. So the 3 people, I expect that Carrie is live streaming today. And I don't know, it doesn't tell us who it is. It just gives us that there are 3 people live streaming, and we're so glad we can offer that. I know that they miss the Zoom and the interaction that they get. But there were a number of folks at the fitness group today, and just a reminder that we do that here on site, so that if you don't want to rush down after that, you can join us here at 9:30, set up on a computer, and that's via Zoom with Jackie. And Jackie Crow, I've heard nothing but good things about her. Everyone loves her. So if you haven't taken advantage of the fitness group, certainly let me know. I'll get you connected. But you can come here and still get here, because we do it live or do the Zoom meeting in room 224, and it's on the big screen, so she's not just a little square on your computer. So anyway, next week we are at Comfort Cafe for lunch. If you haven't signed up, sign up. I think I counted 17 people are signed up for that. And different than other restaurants that we go to, you're responsible for paying your check at your table, and they only take cash, and they recommend a $15 donation, because this is a donation. Everyone who works in the Comfort Cafe is a part of the recovery program, and it's an opportunity for them to work their way through it. And if you were with us the last time we were there, the food is excellent, and the wait staff are just very personable. And there was even a point in the day where they did a song and dance routine for us. So that's something to look forward to as well. If you haven't signed up, you can call, make your reservation. But there's also the signups on the table out there in the hallway. And also the signups are there for Spencer Brown, who will be coming, and he's with the aging. He's going to talk to us how to age well. So maybe you need that. You need to understand that, and also what services they have. And then we're looking forward to Fiesta. We have King Antonio coming. We have the mariachis that we had last year, the all women mariachi group. They were excellent. And then we'll have lunch together there, and that will be our birthday lunch. And then there's like 3 weeks after that we aren't doing anything because of parades and Good Friday and Fiesta happenings. But we'll get that information out. Did you have a question? Jay. Yeah, Jay. Right. Jay Trundle's memorial service will be the 23rd at 1 o'clock. And it will be in the sanctuary, and there will be a reception following that. And a number of folks were asking about Jay and that service. We miss him. We miss him. He was a pretty constant uh, figure around here. And yeah, and he Thursdays and Sundays he was my sidekick. Um, and I whenever I'm driving out that side of town, I think of him and all the places that he would say, "What's the temperature on that clock?" He was a weatherman. But yes, that will be the 23rd at 1 o'clock. Thanks for reminding me. All right, we're excited. We're glad to have Billy Perryman with us. You want to come on up here? We'll. I think Billy's been here with us before. I wasn't here. He's a jack of all trades, that's from what I understand. He's a teacher. He's a tour guide. He's a historian. And just a nice guy too. So we're glad to have Billy with us. He's going to share He's going to share with us about Sam Houston. If I remember right, as I was going through trying to determine what we were going to do in March, Sam Houston's birthday is in March. Am I correct?
That's correct.
So that was one of the reasons why I picked this presentation to be in March. So Billy, thank you for being here with us. We look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you, Dr. Moore. Are you ready for some stories? Some fun stories. I'm a teacher, so I had to warm you up with a prediction adventure this morning on your table there. I'm going to answer those questions that were in your prediction adventure. It wasn't a pop quiz, it was just a prediction adventure. And Reverend Dr. Moore is very correct. March is the birth month of Sam Houston. And on the screen, Sam was born March the 2nd, 1793. And Sam was born in Virginia. And you know that Texas Independence Day is March 2nd also. I can't make these stories up. Sam Houston's birthday and Texas Independence Day are the same day. Isn't that wild? So if I could bring Sam back to life today and walk him through the front door, First Presbyterian, he would be 229 years old. So lots of Botox. And so he's looking good there on the screen. Someone once said he was a magnificent barbarian, somewhat tempered by civilization. You know, I have taught public school and I've worked in schools all over Texas. And a lot of students, I have a hunch, feel that Sam was born in Texas on the Riverwalk. But he was not born in Texas, he was born in Virginia. His parents are on the screen, Samuel Houston and Elizabeth Paxton Houston. It was Sam's great grandfather that immigrated to the colonies, and the Houston family first settled in Pennsylvania. And they were Scots Irish Presbyterians. And then they wanted to get away from the German Lutherans, so they moved down into Virginia, into the Shenandoah Valley. So Sam had 5 brothers and 3 sisters. So there were 9 children in the family. And Sam was the 5th son born in the family. And on the image is this wonderful, on the screen is this wonderful image of Sam when he was very young. He had blue eyes, reddish chestnut color hair. He was 6'2" at full height, and he was very good looking, and he knew it. So as a teacher, I might not enjoy Sam in my classroom because I think he skipped out of school, if you could call it school in those days. Sam was very independent from the onset, and he loved to read, and he learned to read at an early age, and he loved to lose himself in his father's books. And his father, I have read, had a very extensive library there in Virginia, which was, you know, for the frontier of Virginia, that was quite something. So Sam liked to read about Greek history, and he liked to read Homer. And so he was very influenced by these stories of history. I found this quote by one of Sam's teachers, and I'm going to read it to you. It's on the screen also. Often I had determined to whip Sam Houston, but he would come up with such a pretty dish of excuses that I could not do it. When Sam was 13 years old, his father sold their farm in Virginia and was preparing to move the family on out to Tennessee. And so, just as they sold the farm, his father unexpectedly died in his 60s. So, Sam's mom had to move the entire family by herself on out to Tennessee. So that would be 9 children. And their wagons were loaded. And in the wagons, they had all those books from his father's library. And they settled south of Knoxville. This is my homemade map. They settled near a little town south of Knoxville called Maryville. And they settled on a farm that had 419 acres. And his mother took part ownership, I understand, in a store, a little mercantile type store in Maryville. And Sam was supposed to be working on the farm, but he didn't enjoy farm work. And they tried to get him a job working in the store in Maryville, and he didn't like that either. So at age 16, he ran away. He took off at 16 and to live with the nearby Cherokees. And so he really adopted the Cherokee lifestyle, their language, their way of life. And the chief of this nearby tribe, his name was Uluteka, and a substitute name was John Jolly. And I think Chief Uluteka sort of became an adopted father for Sam because Sam's father had passed away when he was 13. And Chief John Jolly really took a shine to Sam and gave him a name, the Raven. And Sam also had his own medicine animal, the eagle. And there are various legends in Sam's life about the eagle having mystical powers upon his life at pivotal times. Well, there's a story that Sam went back to Maryville and asked his mother for $100 to buy his Cherokee friends some gifts. And she gave him the money, but said, "You'll have to pay all of it back, every cent." So Sam had to get a job. Now, I went to college several years, got a master's degree, and then went back to graduate school again to be a teacher. But Sam just opened a school at 19 outside Maryville in a log cabin and said, "Hey, come be in my school." So Sam charged each student who attended his school $8 to be in his schoolhouse. And after a very short period, he earned back that $100 he owed his mother. Now, on the screen, you can see what they found above the door casing in the schoolhouse, a pair of lead knuckles. So perhaps that's how Sam was keeping discipline in his little schoolhouse at age 19. Let me tell you, today he would be on CNN. He'd be fired if he was using lead knuckles. The War of 1812 was traumatic, and there's the story that our United States recruiting army came to Maryville looking for recruits. Pretty famous story. You'll find it in the literature about Sam. A soldier gave a speech and announced to the crowd listening that uh, anyone who picked up a silver dollar off his drum would automatically be enrolled in the U.S. Army. And Sam heard the speech. He grabbed the silver dollar. He was 20 years old. He needed his mother's permission, though, to join the U.S. Army. And his mother said yes. And then she said, "You can join, but the door to my house will always be open to a hero, but it's going to be closed to a coward." And before he left with the U.S. Army, his mother gave him a little gold band that had one word inside. And the word is on the screen now. There it comes across the screen. There was one of those prediction questions. The word was honor, Honor. And he wore that band on his pinky finger throughout his life. And at the end of my presentation, you're going to hear me refer back to that ring. Well, Sam found himself at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, Alabama, under General Andrew Jackson. And here is a public domain map of that battle. They were fighting against the Creek Indians who had sided with the British. My understanding is the first person who charged into battle was shot. Sam was one of the early folks to charge into battle, leading his platoon, when Sam was shot in the upper thigh of his leg with a barbed arrow. I remember my students really enjoying this story. "Man, he's shot in the leg with a barbed arrow." All right, a soldier tried to yank the arrow out. It wouldn't come out. They kept telling you got to seek medical attention. Sam said, "No, you just pull harder." The soldier pulled harder. The arrow came ripping out of his leg. I like to say a lot of Sam came out with it when they pulled the arrow out. So if you shoot me in an arrow today, we're calling 911. I'm going to the hospital. But Sam, they pulled the arrow out of his leg and he went back into battle. He went back into action that day. And he took a musket ball in the right arm and the right shoulder before the battle was over. They won the battle, but he had 3 wounds. And the doctors thought surely he was going to die. and they sort of just left him to die, thought he was too far gone. He suffered during the night, and the next morning, much to the doctor's surprise, if you can call them doctors in those days, they were amazed that Sam was still alive the next morning. He was placed on a litter and taken, hauled over the ground, bouncing up and down 60 miles. It's a horrible, gruesome scene. He must have been tough, right? He survived. He didn't die. No antibiotics, no penicillin, had those horrible, horrible bloody wounds. It was a year after the battle before a doctor could get one of those musket balls out of his right shoulder, and he almost died from the surgery. He suffered for the rest of his life from those wounds. He eventually resigns from the United States Army, moving right along here, and he decides to become a lawyer. And my understanding is he read law for 6 months and passed the bar exam. And he set up his law practice in Lebanon, which took him past Nashville and past the Hermitage, the home of Andy Jackson and his wife, Rachel. And I think that Sam Houston saw Andrew Jackson maybe as a father figure. And Andrew Jackson really liked Sam Houston because he'd had experience with him as a soldier. So these two became very good friends. Sam was a protege for Andrew Jackson. And they would talk, this is my map I made, they would talk about the future of the United States, and they would imagine that the United States might take up the whole continent one day across from ocean to ocean. And they kept looking at that land called Texas. My goodness. Well, Sam Houston, thanks to Andrew Jackson, represented the state of Tennessee in Congress eventually. And thanks to Andrew Jackson's political savviness, connections, at age 34, Sam Houston was elected governor of the state of Tennessee. Can you imagine? Now, I understand he's the only American in history that has been governor of two states. He was first governor of Tennessee, and you probably came here knowing that he was governor of Texas much later in 1859. So here's probably what he looked like as governor. Check out that hairdo right there. He's handsome, he's good looking. He had everything except one thing he still didn't have. What was it he didn't have? He did not have a wife. From my research and my understanding, ladies and gentlemen, Sam liked the ladies, and the ladies liked him back. All right, here's a good story, right? So I understand that he once dated the great granddaughter of Martha Washington, Mary Park Custis. But Mary Park Custis jilted Sam. She chose another man to be her husband, not Sam. And now I'm going to show you her profile image on date.com. Are you ready? Are you ready to see Mary Park Custis? Now remember, she jilted him, right? All right, here she is. There she is. Of, of, of course. You want to say that again? Little off. This is probably definitely a portrait when she was much older. But, you know, she chose the quiet, shy type. I've got to continue her story. She chose a bashful cadet by the name of Robert E. Lee. Have you ever heard of that man? I find that fascinating. When Sam was in his 30s, he did find a wife. Her name was Eliza Allen. She was about 20 years old. Sam went to the Allen family and asked for Eliza's hand in marriage. And the Allen family was delighted. The governor of Tennessee wanted to marry their daughter. So they said yes. And they married. And January of 1829, I just flashed on the screen, in April 1829, the marriage fell apart. And there's a story on his, oh, why? On his wedding day, Sam said he knew when a raven fell down dead on the ground in front of his horse, there was going to be trouble. And ladies and gentlemen, I understand on the honeymoon night, Sam had to sleep on the sofa. So there was trouble right from the beginning. You know, people always ask me what happened. Why did she leave him? You know, I'm intimating based on what I read, she was probably in love with someone else, and that she just acquiesced to her family and agreed to marry Sam because they were so farthest of marriage to the governor of Tennessee. Have you ever had children that want to please their parents? You know, I'm one of those too. So, anyway, after 11 weeks, the marriage fell apart. Do you think people talked about it? Oh my goodness, this was huge gossip, big gossip in Tennessee. If this occurred today, it would be on CNN. David Muir would spend 30 minutes on it tonight on ABC News. Everybody was talking. Sam was humiliated. And there's a funny story that a friend looked at Sam during this time one day and said, Sam, you got to tell us what happened between you and Eliza. You've got to tell us. Everybody's talking about it. And Sam looked at his friend and said, can you keep a secret? And the friend said, sure. And Sam said, so can I. He never told him. Sam was so despondent, he resigned as governor of Tennessee. He left Tennessee in the middle of his governorship. And whenever there was trouble in his life, he would go back to his Cherokee friends. And by this time, they had been transported to Arkansas, Oklahoma territory. If you look at the maps, it'll say Indian territory. Um, there's a story that on the way to visit or stay with his Cherokee friends, he was on a boat on the Cumberland River and he thought about jumping off into the water and ending his life. Very scary. And there's a legend that he stopped. He didn't jump because an eagle swooped down just in the nick of time, right when he was ready to jump, maybe saved his life. So that may be a legend, but it makes for a good story. There's also another story on the way to Arkansas, Oklahoma territory. Sam and a couple of friends were in the woods camping. They built a fire one night. Sam was finished with civilization. He'd been humiliated. His wife left him. And so I think they had a little bit too much of, let's say, the drink. And they got to talking about, the most civilized thing about civilization are the clothes that people wore. And since he was finished with civilization, he was also finished with his clothes. So as the fire was burning in front of them, Sam got the idea to take his clothes off and burn them up. And so he took all the articles off, pitched them in the fire. His friends took their clothes off, threw them in the fire. They went to sleep. They woke up the next morning, realized what they'd done. Sam was glad he had an extra set of clothes to wear. One of the friends did not. They left him there in the woods to figure it out for himself. I never said this in the classroom, but they were probably drunk. All right. So Sam takes up with his Cherokee friends again, and he takes a Cherokee wife. She's part Cherokee. Her name is Diana Rogers Gentry. Her father was Anglo, and her mother was Native American. This image looks like a woman, but it's supposed to be Sam Houston. So Sam takes a Cherokee wife, and he has his own wigwam, his own trading post, and for all practical purposes, he's an adopted member of the Cherokee Nation. So Sam gets a name by the Cherokees because of the drink. They start calling him that right there on the screen. I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to let you read that right there. And while he's living with the Cherokees, and he stays with them for couple of years, he receives a letter from Tennessee. It's about his mother. His mother's extremely ill. He rushes back to Tennessee, leaves his Cherokee friends behind. He gets to his mother just in time, and she passes away shortly after he arrives. Her death affected Sam greatly. So Sam, on behalf of the Cherokees, goes back to Washington, D.C., and while he's in Washington, there's a congressman from Ohio named William Stanberry who hates Andrew Jackson, who is now the president of the United States. And Congressman Stanberry gets to Jackson by humiliating Sam Houston. He accused Sam Houston of fraud or something with Indian rations. Anyway, he slanders Sam Houston's name on the floor of the House of Representatives. Honor was a very big thing, especially for Sam Houston. And he hears what Congressman Stanberry is saying about him on the floor of the House of Rep. And Sam Houston decides to challenge Congressman Stanberry to a duel. And Congressman Stanberry didn't accept, but started carrying some pistols on his person for protection. Well, now the story gets even juicier because one night, walking down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., Sam Houston and Congressman Stanberry met each other. And Sam Houston walks up to Congressman Stanberry and says, "Are you William Stanberry?" He says, "I am." Sam says, "Well, you are just a rascal." And Sam Houston takes his hickory stick that he plucked from the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home. He probably whittled that stick, and he took his hickory stick and whopped Congressman Stanbury upside the head. Congressman Stanbury runs. They start fighting in Pennsylvania Avenue. They're on the ground, probably. Congressman Stanbury's yelling, "Oh, don't, don't beat me with a stick." They're fighting, these two grown men. Can you imagine this happening today in Pennsylvania Avenue? A congressman fighting in the street? And yeah, you can. And so Congressman Stanbury happened to remember, hey, I got two pistols. I could defend myself. So he pulls out one of those pistols and points it right to Sam Houston's chest. And he pulls the trigger. And guess what? The gun locked. It didn't fire. Sam couldn't believe his luck. He gave Congressman Stanbury a thorough thrashing, and Congressman Stanbury had him placed on trial in the United States House of Representatives. It's illegal to whip a congressman, can't do that. Sam Houston, often dressed in Cherokee clothing. Andrew Jackson said, for heaven's sakes, put on some different clothing for this trial. Sam Houston's attorney, you're going to like this, during the trial, his attorney was somebody you know, somebody called Francis Scott Key. Have you ever heard of that? I like to say to students he could write lyrics but couldn't defend anyone. Francis Scott Key had a problem. The problem is now on the screen. There it is. So Sam wound up defending himself in the trial. And I understand from what I've read, the trial was a good bit of theater for Sam Houston. He was at his utmost during this trial. And there were public spectators watching the trial. And after the trial was over, Junius Booth, does that name ring a bell? Junius Booth, the father of John Wilkes Booth, great Shakespearean actor, Junius had been watching the trial. And he ran down to Sam after the trial was over and said, I give you my laurels for the wonderful performance that Sam held in this trial defending himself. He received a reprimand. There was a civil trial. He was supposed to pay $500, but Andrew Jackson stepped in and took care of that for Sam. So Andrew Jackson's probably pretty embarrassed at Sam. And it was about this time that Sam, probably with the encouragement of Andrew Jackson, took off for Texas. And I heard a lecture by a professor one time that said he believes that thrashing that Sam gave Congressman Stanbury was the impetus that sent Sam to Texas. So at 39, after this incident, Sam gets out of the country and he goes to Mexican Texas. What about that Cherokee wife? What happened to her? He said goodbye to his Cherokee wife. He gave her most of his worldly possessions. She did remarry again, but died only 4 years after Sam departed. So on the screen, I have 39 as the age Sam enters Mexican Texas. What about that first wife, Eliza? Well, they filed for divorce in 1833. They'd been apart 5 years. The divorce was not official until 1837. And Sam enters Texas in 1832. So you can see it was after the revolution before Eliza officially divorces Sam. So Texas is right here, Mexican Texas. Sam pops into Texas. There's a legend that there was an eagle welcoming him to Texas. Maybe that's just a legend, makes for a good story. He settles in Nacogdoches, sets up a law practice in that frontier town, and he swears to be a good Mexican citizen, and he's baptized a Catholic. You know, they're supposed to practice Catholic religion at this time in Mexican Texas. I'm going to put on the screen a couple of other places he visited: Nacogdoches, San Felipe. Have you heard of that? And a place called San Antonio de Bejar. Have you ever heard of that town? Of course you have. That's called San Antonio. Well, Sam visited the Veramendi Palace here in San Antonio. Unfortunately, that wonderful Spanish colonial residence is gone, but we did save the doors. And the doors are only a few blocks from First Presbyterian. They're stored at the Alamo. Did you know that? And they were on display, those doors, for many years. Right now, they're in their repository, so I understand. You know, it's a complicated story, the Texas Revolution. It's part of a much bigger picture. In 1833, there was a consultation in Texas. The citizens of Texas wanted full statehood for Texas and not to be attached as a territory to the Mexican state of Coahuila. So in 1833, Stephen F. Austin was sent to Mexico City to petition for statehood. And he was jailed in 1834 and he was released in 1835. During this time, there was a lot of turmoil. I've heard it be spoken of as sort of like a Mexican Civil War, and Texas was part of that. Santa Anna was elected president in 1833. In 1835, he abrogated the Constitution of Mexico and dismissed the state governments. Big trouble in Mexico, in Mexican Texas, all kinds of issues. I have a little flash there on Gonzales. That's where we mark the beginning of the Texas Revolution in October, pardon me, of 1835. Now, this part of the story, you're probably familiar with 1836 when the Alamo siege occurred 186 years ago this year. On March 1st, as the Alamo siege concurrently is occurring in San Antonio, there's a convention that convenes at Washington on the Brazos. Of course, this is a replica of the building where those delegates are meeting. Sam Houston arrives at this meeting about March 1st, 1836. And on March 2nd, at that meeting, those delegates declare independency for Texas from Mexico. And it's also Sam Houston's birthday. I just can't believe it. Texas Independence Day, Sam Houston's birthday, the same day. I feel like there's divine providence watching over this whole story. Oh my goodness. Of course, while these delegates are meeting, they're receiving letters from the Alamo. On March 4th, Sam once again is made Major General of the Army of the Republic. And, and I like to say, what army? Where were they? I mean, oh my goodness. On March the 6th, the Alamo siege ended and the defenders were slain and killed. But the same day that the Alamo fell, only a few blocks from where we're sitting, on that same day, Sam Houston left Washington on the Brazos for Gonzales. This, I can get there in my SUV in a few hours, but it took Sam Houston 5 days to get from Washington on the Brazos to Gonzales. And I have the timeline up there on the screen. When Sam arrived in Gonzales March the 11th, he found Colonel Neal and 350 volunteers there, probably waiting for some action, somebody to tell them what to do, perhaps. And that group of men became the nucleus for Sam Houston's army, which would later defeat Santa Anna at San Jacinto or San Jacinto. Sam Houston had a spy at this time, Deef Smith, and Deef was sent to the Alamo on March the 13th to find out what was going on. But the story. On the night of March 13th, Deef Smith went back to Gonzales, and he wasn't alone. With him was Miss Susanna Dickinson, her baby girl, Angelina, and Colonel William Barrett Travis's slave, Joe. And they received the news that night. It was confirmed the Alamo defenders were dead. You could hear the women and children screaming in Gonzales. They learned their husbands, brothers, sons had been killed. There was panic. What was Sam to do? He orders the town to be evacuated. He takes his little army, and everyone starts moving eastbound away from Gonzales that night. And eventually, they set Gonzales on fire and burn the little town. There's a touching story that Sam sent a courier to go fetch a blind woman with 6 children who lived near Gonzales to tell her to join in the retreat and to let her know her husband had been killed at the Alamo. What a sad sight this was in Texas. So now we have the citizens of Gonzales and Sam's tiny little army moving eastward. He probably didn't know what was going to happen, but he knew he needed to go east. The further he went east, the further he could pull Santa Anna's armies away from their supply lines, And the further east he went, the more time he could buy to prepare his men. He had a ragtag group of men that were frontier men, and they were not used to taking orders from anyone. And they had a mind of their own. It's a miracle he was able to do anything with them. I just showed you a couple of places on the Colorado River where he disciplined his men. I've got Texans in the audience today, and you've heard of the runaway scrape. By now, there's a mass panic, a mass exodus out of Texas the spring of 1836. And you know how cold it is this morning. It may have been a little bit like that during the runaway scrape. It was raining quite a bit, I understand. The rivers were swollen. There were no bridges, and these people are trying to cross these rivers, the Colorado, the Brazos, using ferry boats. Many people were sick. Some people died during the runaway scrape. 186 years ago this spring, Texas was a scary place to be, with everyone rushing toward Louisiana to escape Santana's armies. No one knew exactly what was going to happen. They knew there was trouble. Of course, Goliad massacre occurs March 27th. So we have one horror on top of another horror. And so everyone's very much afraid. Santa Anna burns the town of Harrisburg. Did you know that? And the town had been evacuated. And he sends Colonel Alamante to the coast to capture these people, these delegates that have declared independence. But the delegates escape from New Washington for Galveston Island on the screen right there. And so they get away for Galveston. And so Santana now turns his attention north and east of Harrisburg. Sam Houston, meanwhile, was up here at Jerry Gross's plantation along the Brazos, and he was disciplining and training his men. And some of his men deserted the army. Some were mad at him. They kept saying, "Please fight." David Burnett wrote him a nasty letter and said, "The enemy are laughing you to scorn. Please stand up and fight." Well, to make a long story short, finally, Sam Houston crosses the flooded Brazos River. How are you going to cross a flooded river? Divine providence. Just in time, a steamboat showed up called the Yellowstone. And they used that steamboat to ferry his army, approximately 900, back and forth across the flooded Brazos River. It took them 2 days, I understand, to get everyone across to the east side, the east bank of the Brazos River. I love these digital images. So, about April 18th, Sam Houston's army enters the burned town of Harrisburg. And I understand he left behind the men in his army that were ill, maybe measles and also dysentery. And so that's all I say to students. I'll tell them your teacher will have a unit on dysentery next year. That's all I can tell you about that. So they left behind the ill, those that were ill in Harrisburg. And then he had about 900 able bodied men. They march on eastward to San Jacinto. They cross Buffalo Bayou and they camp here in a grove of trees with their backs against Buffalo Bayou. This homemade map shows you Lynch's ferry boat crossing. Sam Houston took charge of that crossing. Here comes Santa Anna and about 800 soldiers up this road, and Santa Anna backs his army up to the other side of this grassy plain. Santa Anna's main forces were still west of the Brazos, and they got kind of bogged down in the mud. They were having a terrible time. So Santa Anna had a small force. On the night of April 20th, about 500 more soldiers under General Cos arrived to assist Santa Anna. So when the sun came up on April 21st, 1836, Santa Anna had more soldiers than Sam Houston at San Jacinto. So the story is on April 21st, Santa Anna thought there would be an attack by Sam Houston, and an attack did not occur. And so perhaps Santa Anna became overconfident. And so about noon, he orders his soldiers to relax. They were wet. They'd been marching through the mud. Their clothes were wet. Their gunpowder was wet. Dry your clothes, dry your gunpowder. Everyone relax. We don't believe there were even sentries posted on the ridge line up there between the two armies. So overconfidence may have played a key role here. So while Santana is overconfident and relaxing on the other side, at 12 noon until 2, Sam Houston, approximately time, was having a war council, and he felt the time was right for an attack. So that afternoon, 900 Texians are ready to attack. And in the line of 900 was Juan Seguin from San Antonio de Bejar and 25 Tejanos. Sam Houston was riding a beautiful white horse, Saracen, up and down the line of 900 men. At 4 o'clock, April 21st, 1836, Sam Houston drew his sword, and 900 Texians stepped out from the shadows of those oak trees and quickly started walking through the grass to the ridge line. There's a report that he gave a speech, but exactly what he said, no one knows for sure. They had a couple of drummers and a fifer. The only song they knew together, those musicians, was a bawdy song called Will You Come to the Bower? And so here's our little Texas Army coming through the grass, 900, April 21st, 1836 at 4 o'clock. Here's my map. They only have two cannon. They get within 200 yards of this ridge line and they fire their cannon, which are stuffed with shrapnel. And as they fire the cannon, they charge over that ridge line and catch Santana's soldados by surprise. And that's when somebody yells, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." So Santana's soldados are used to strict military commands. And they're caught by surprise. And so it's kind of a melee. And Santana is in a red and white striped tent. Now, therein lies a juicy story. There's some legend that maybe Santana was having an afternoon dalliance in the tent when the battle started. Who knows? But Santana, one reference says he ran out of his tent, wringing his hands, ran back, and then took off in a westward direction, trying to reconnect with his main forces. I remember in my college Texas history class what my professor said. Do you want to know what he said? He said Santana came running out of his tent wearing his yellow silk drawers. So Sam Houston's beautiful white horse took 5 musket balls in her side and she was shot. Sam Houston mounted a second horse, so the story goes. And then that horse was shot from under him, and Sam Houston took a musket ball in his ankle. There were 21 bone fragments. Don't you know that hurt? And his boot filled with blood. He mounted, Sam, a third horse. The battle was over in 18 minutes, but Sam Houston lost control of his men. They would not stop the killing until the sun fell on the horizon. A lot of Santana soldados ran to the nearby waters and they jumped in, held their breath as long as they could. Then, when they took a breath, you know what happened. They say that Peggy's Lake, right here, that afternoon turned red from all those that were killed in Peggy's Lake. You can see geography played a role in this battle because Santana was backed up to San Jacinto Bay, marshlands here, and then, of course, Sam Houston was rather trapped also. So one side or the other was going to have a victory. Well, it turned out it would be Sam Houston. So the unofficial count of the dead, over 600 of Santana's soldados were killed. How many Texians died from the battle? That day, about 9. So it was a lopsided victory. It was really incredible. The Battle of San Jacinto, April 21st, 1836. It changed the course of history in Texas forever. Now, as a side note, this land belonged to a woman named Peggy McCormick. This was her farm, and she came home to find somebody had a battle on her farm, and she was furious. And she went to Sam Houston. Now, just think, okay, this big victory, and she's furious. She went to Sam Houston and said, "Clean up this mess." And Sam said something like, "Well, your farm is going to be famous in history forever." And she said, "Forget history. Clean up this mess." So anyway, she was not happy. I can just have this image in my mind of Aunt Peggy McCormick furious with Sam Houston for messing up her farm. Anyway, maybe she got over it. The story, as you probably surely know, Santana was captured the next day. They say he was wearing a disguise, white pants, blue trooper jacket. This is a very stylized rendering by William Huddle um, of the surrender of Santana to Sam Houston. Of course, Sam Houston is horizontal with his bandaged ankle, and everybody's all dressed up. They wouldn't have been dressed up at that time, but I understand Sam Houston's soldiers really wanted to kill Santana on the spot, but Sam Houston said he's worth more to us alive than dead. There was an interpreter. Santana was forced to sign the Treaty of Valesco, and Santa Anna was held prisoner for several months in Texas before he was released and sent to Washington, D.C. to meet President Andrew Jackson. As you probably know, Santana came back in power in Mexico. He would come into power, go out of power, come in, go out, go in, go out. And he outlived Sam Houston. Santana died near Mexico City in obscurity in the 19th century. He's a fascinating character, that Santana. Anyway, so this wonderful painting depicts the surrender of Santana to Sam Houston the next day in 1836. My favorite author on Sam Houston is James Haley. And in his book about Sam Houston, he wrote, "The fact is that if any other figure in Texas had commanded the army, the revolution would have ended in disaster." That is a pretty strong quote. And I think that speaks a lot about Sam, his place in history, and how he has affected who we are today. So, after the Battle of San Jacinto, Texas became its own nation from 1836 to 1845. We were the Republic of Texas, and we had an election in the fall of 1836. And this is the winner for our first president, uh, constitutional president, the Republic of Texas, elected with Sam Houston, 4,000 votes plus. He was very popular, not with everyone, but out of the three candidates running for president, Sam Houston won. Andrew Jackson did not recognize Texas right away. He was very afraid of recognizing Texas and provoking Mexico in a war. In that election of the fall of 1836, there was a question about should we join the US, and everyone said yes except for 93 people. So Texas was ready to join the US, but of course it would take almost 10 years before the United States annexed Texas as a 28th state. This is a little fun with our flags. There's a little bit of a question here on this one, but it's kind of cool with Texas and the star, always a single star representing us in the flag. But this was our official flag the first 3 years with the blue background, the gold star. And then in 1839, we adopted red, white, and blue with a single star, which is our state flag today. The white for purity, the red bravery, and the blue for loyalty. There were many problems in the Republic of Texas. It was not paradise. There was always that threat from Mexico. There were Native American issues. And we were bankrupt, had not a lick of money. A lot of the towns had been burned in the revolution. Gonzales, Harrisburg, San Felipe, and official recognition from the U.S. did not come immediately. We were sitting out here without any money, desperate, almost ready to be attacked again. Is anyone going to help us? We're just sitting out here isolated. I like to show you the different capitals of the Republic of Texas. I call this capital games. West Columbia for a short time was our capital. Then the new town of Houston, built on the ashes of Harrisburg, was our capital. And of course, today Houston is our largest city. I think Sam would be thrilled to know Houston, Texas in 2022 is our largest city. And guess out of all those capitals, guess which one Sam Houston preferred as the capital of Texas? He preferred Houston as the capital of Texas, and he tried to move it there at one point in his second term as president of the Republic. Austin became capital in 1839. In 1842, Sam tries to move the capital. He gets as far as Washington on the Brazos, and then it's returned to Austin in 1844. And there were some elections after we became a state on what should be the capital. And the choices usually, I believe the choices were Austin, Houston, or Waco. Waco was a choice. So there, every 20 years, a couple of times, there were some votes in Texas, but Austin kept winning as the choice. So today, Austin is a capital. This is kind of fun to show you a replica of the first Capitol building in Texas. Wow, it's pretty fancy, isn't it? Pretty primitive, pretty provincial. I found this burning of the first Capitol building in Austin. Accidentally, it was set on fire and burned. Of course, the present Capitol building replaced this building, and our president Capitol was finished in 1888. I believe that's correct. So when Sam, during the Republic of Texas era, Sam has more romance blooming. Now he's had Eliza, and that didn't work out. His Cherokee wife, he left her, and she remarried and died. So he's on to his third wife here. Here we go. Romance is there. She is. All right. He's 47, and she's about 20 when they marry. When Sam was injured at the Battle of San Jacinto, he was sent by boat to New Orleans for medical care, and she saw him in New Orleans coming off the boat, and she had a cold chill, just like a spirit went over her. She was fascinated by that man they were carrying off the boat, and she felt a direct connection to him. Well, later, Sam would meet this girl in Alabama at a little party. It's like a strawberry festival. And of course, they fell in love with each other. There was a huge age difference between the two. Her mother was not happy. Margaret, what are you thinking? You want to marry Sam Houston, this wild man? He's got a reputation, girl. And she said, Mama, I love him. I'm going to marry him. This was a strong Baptist family. All right. And of course, Sam, so her mother insisted they get married in Alabama. So Sam and Margaret Lee marry. Huge age difference. He brings her to Texas. Her mother comes with them to keep an eye on things. So, it was Margaret Lee Houston who tamed Sam Houston. I look at that sweet little face and think, girl, what what did you do? You had magical powers. She helped him with the drink, helped him get rid of the drink. She helped him with religion. She was always concerned about his salvation. And so on the screen is the man that baptized Sam Houston. And this is one of your prediction adventure questions. So Houston was baptized at Rocky Creek in 1854. And guess who that is on the screen? There he is, the great grandfather of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Have you ever heard of LBJ? He was a future president of the United States. The great grandfather of LBJ baptized Sam Houston. Now, on the screen also, I have a little comment about Sam attending church. And Reverend Dr. Moore, you'll be so glad he's not in your congregation. Sam Houston knew the Bible well, that is true, and he would often interrupt the preacher and challenge them on their theology during the middle of the sermon. Wouldn't that just be miserable? Oh my goodness. Now, there's this famous story about when Sam was baptized at Rocky Creek after he was baptized in the creek, full immersion. Someone said, well, Sam, how do you feel now all your sins are washed away? And he said, heaven help those fish down the stream. Here's another funny story, or a little surprise for you. Not funny, but kind of a surprise. I understand, I've read that Margaret Lee is a distant cousin to this man. And guess who that is? That is Robert E. Lee. And I'm looking at LEA there and LEE, and I don't know the connection, but I've read that in one of my resource books. The second president of the Republic of Texas was a man that Sam hated. He hated Maribel. That's a strong word, isn't it? He did not like Maribel Lamar. Maribel Lamar had a complete opposite policy regarding Native Americans and Sam. Maribel Lamar had grand ideas. Just look at that face there. So to insult Maribel Lamar at Lamar's inauguration, Sam Houston dressed as George Washington in the colonial costume, and Sam, dressed as George, gave a 3-hour farewell speech. so that everyone would go home and no one would be there in the audience to listen or watch Lamar be inaugurated. So he insulted Lamar at Lamar's inauguration. Now, does that tell you about Sam? He had a lot of theatrics, right? And a lot of drama. He was just the charismatic character. There needs to be a musical. There's the musical Hamilton. There could be one Houston. Sam Houston was the third president of the Republic of Texas. And these are our presidents. Just to remind you, we had four presidents of our republic. Dr. Anson Jones was the last when we were annexed by the United States. In 1846, there was a final ceremony in Austin. Dr. Jones said the Republic of Texas is no more. I remember this so well in my history class in college. The professor said Sam Houston caught the Texas flag as they lowered it in Austin and announced the Republic of Texas is over. It's no more. We're now the 28th state, United States. But I thought it was so poignant. Who catches the flag when it comes down the pole? It's Sam Houston. He is just synonymous with Texas. So you've already heard this quote. But when we became the 28th state, who was our first senator representing Texas in Washington? Sam Houston and Thomas Jefferson Rusk were our first senators. And Sam served as senator from Texas in Washington for 13 years, and there was no Southwest Airlines. So he's traveling back and forth uh, to Washington and then back to Texas during recess. And it was during this time he and Margaret, oh my goodness, they had all these children, 8 children. So I went too fast there. I went too fast. But in 1857, Sam Houston runs for governor of Texas. And you would think he'd be elected, right? He wasn't. He lost in 1857 his first bid for the governorship. However, I want to show you his campaign travels in the southern half of Texas in 1857. Are you ready? Now, I like talking to you. Sometimes I talk to people from all over the nation about this, and they don't know where these towns are, but you know. Here was his campaign trail in 1857 in the South, and he considered Waco the South. He's going to be in Waco Monday, July 13th. Now, he's traveling by a buggy that's painted red, scarlet red, so everybody can see him. On July the 15th, he's in Cameron giving a speech, traveling by horse and buggy, right? On the 16th, he is in Caldwell. Now, you probably know where these towns are on the map. Now he's in LaGrange on July 18th. He's getting around, isn't he? Oh my goodness, Interstate 35 was not there. Bastrop on July 20th. Then on July 22nd, he's in Austin. Then in Lockhart, July 23rd. Well, he's in San Marcos on the 24th. Is he traveling or what? Oh my goodness. Seguin on the 25th. New Braunfels on the 27th. And look, San Antonio the 28th. Yeah, that's not all. Gonzales on the 30th. And then he zips over to Victoria August 1st. Isn't that amazing? I marvel at his schedule and campaigning for governor. But on his playbill, he also had this at the bottom. I'm going to flash. This was probably the most important thing advertising his visits to these towns. He wrote this: the ladies are most particularly invited to attend. He loved the ladies loved him. Somewhere in my research, I read that when he was giving a speech, if there were no ladies in the crowd, it was hot. Look at the date. July, was it hot? He would take his shirt off if there were no women in the crowd and give his speech shirtless. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if Governor Abbott took his shirt off and gave a speech today? It might be on Instagram. All right. 1857, here are the election results. I told you he lost to Hardin Runnels, but he got Hardin Runnels back in 1859. Here are the election results in 1859. They flipped the votes. Sam Houston won, defeated Hardin in 1859, and became the seventh governor of the state of Texas from 1859 to 1861. But look at those dates, 1859 to 1861. Was this a troubled time? Oh my goodness. In 1860, Sam Houston and John Bell were the top contenders for nominees under the Constitutional Union Party for president. And the Constitutional Union Party chose John Bell as their nominee. If you remember your history, there were four candidates running in 1860 for the presidency. Have you heard of Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, John Bell, and somebody by the name of Abraham Lincoln? So John Bell and Sam Houston were the only two Southern Democrats that voted against the Kansas Nebraska Act. So I'm just sharing this to let you know. Sam Houston had a little bit of an inroad. It didn't go very far in being a contender for president of the United States. So Abraham Lincoln won the election in 1860, and all the Southern governors were ready to secede except one. And guess who that was? The governor of Texas, Sam Houston. He knew what the feeling was to secede, and he did not want that to happen. There was a secessionist convention after the popular vote in Austin, and they put a demand to Sam as governor, hey, you're going to have to sign an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. And there's a legend, and maybe it happened, but there's the story, the family story, that he was walking the governor's mansion all night, March 15th, 1861, trying to decide whether he was going to sign an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. And the story is Margaret was downstairs and could hear the floor creaking as he walked back and forth. The next morning, he came downstairs, looked at his wife, and said, and it's on the screen there, Margaret, I will never do it. He refused to sign an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy and therefore was removed as governor of Texas. Ed Clark was sworn in as governor. The Houston family left the governor's mansion March 16th and moved east. And then eventually they wound up in Huntsville, Texas. Just for fun, these are the counties that voted against secession. Do you recognize any counties here? Kind of close to Bexar County. And then we have Angelina in deep East Texas. And then the counties in green are along the Red River, bordering Texas and Oklahoma. It was very regional where these counties were opposed to secession. Just kind of interesting. There were 18 of them opposing secession. So in Huntsville, Sam goes. His oldest son, Sam Jr., fights in the Civil War for the Confederacy. These are the children of Sam and Margaret. There were 8, 4 boys and 4 girls. You see, they had a boy, and then what did they have? 4 girls, and then they had 3 more boys. Uh-oh, have you looked at that name? Look what he named one of his sons, Andrew Jackson Houston, after Andrew Jackson. He loved Andrew Jackson, and he got to Andrew Jackson as Andrew Jackson was dying, and he had his son, Sam Jr., with him. And I have read that when Andrew Jackson died, Sam was right there, and he put his head on Andrew Jackson's chest and wept and told his son, you have seen this great man. And there was just this real tight relationship between Sam Houston and Andrew Jackson. I find these names interesting. Will Rogers, Houston. Here's the first child, Sam Jr. He was wounded at the Battle of Shiloh, and he had a Bible in his coat or something. You see that bullet hole? Saved his life. Where's that Bible? It's in my briefcase today. I'm going to pass it. No, I'm teasing. It's just checking to see if you're listening. It's at the Sam Houston Memorial Museum in Huntsville. Isn't that cool? It's just so interesting. I'm going to show you this picture of his last surviving daughter. Look where her funeral was held, in the Alamo. And the 6 flags of Texas were around her casket. I read a really kind of a funny story before she died. She was in the Alamo shrine, and there was a piece of furniture in there that belonged to the Houston family. And she just happened to be leaning on it. And a visitor was in there and looked at her and said, don't lean on that. That's a relic from the Houston family. And she said, so am I. So Antoinette Power Nettie was died in 1932. She's laid to rest here in San Antonio, and she was, of course, placed in state in the Alamo Shrine. Here's Andrew Jackson Houston. Look, he was a senator at 87. He got the money, the appropriation, the funds to finish the San Jacinto Monument. It's so like those monuments. We can't get enough money to finish them. Think of the Washington Monument. It took forever, but we finally did, thanks to Andrew Jackson Houston. This was the last child born to Sam and Margaret Lee. This is Temple. And Temple was born in the governor's mansion. He was the first child born there. For students today, they're so surprised. You mean that mansion's that old? It's still there today in Austin. They say that Temple was the most like his dad. He had his dad's charisma. He was an attorney also. You can see his lifespan, 1860 to 1905. It's a cute picture of Temple Lee. Did you know Sam was 67 when he had his last child? So, yeah, isn't that interesting? He was a slaveholder. This was Eliza. She stayed with the family, I understand, till the very end. So, Sam died July 26, 1863, in Huntsville. I heard this in a lecture one time. There were reporters outside waiting for the news. You know how the reporters are, they want the latest story. And someone said to Sam, there are reporters outside. What should I do? He said, I want you to get two reporters, put one on this side of the bed, one on the other. I'm going to die like Jesus Christ with a thief on either side of me. He did not like journalists, reporters. Sam died at 6:15 p.m. July 26, 1863, in the middle of the Civil War. He died at that specific time, and at Huntsville, the Memorial Museum, I think they still have all the clocks set at 6:15 to show you the time Sam died. This is the house where he died, and his family that was available was present around his bed when he died, and Margaret was reading passages of the Bible to Sam on July 26th. She's strong Baptist. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, but they say his last words, he opened his eyes at 6:50 and said three final words to his wife. And this is pretty famous. And with students, I remember presenting to a group of students one time. I was right at this dramatic moment, like his last three words were, and the little boy yells out, I love you. And those were not his last three words. His last three words were Texas, Texas, Margaret. But I think it's interesting, his love for Texas. He's he was so upset that Texas left the Union. He did not want Texas to join the Confederacy, and he worked so hard for Texas to be part of the Union. So it really troubled him as to what would happen to his beloved Texas. So he dies, his last words to Margaret, and when he died, touching story, she took his hand and she pulled that ring off to show the children that one word inside that gold band. And there it is, Honor. I remember teaching this in the classroom. We were reading a story, and someone asked, where is the ring? Where is it? I'm happy to say I know where it is. It is, let me see if I'm going to pull it up. There he is. Well, he's wearing it here on his pinky finger. Margaret took it, thank goodness. And today, that ring, where is it? Guess what? It's at the San Jacinto Monument Museum. What a great place, right? It's on the first floor under a glass case. As far as I know, it's still there. It was there the last time I looked. I was so excited when I found that ring. Imagine me taking that ring to Antiques Roadshow. Imagine that. They turn the ring so you can see the word honor inscribed on the interior. I think that that's a beautiful story about the ring. We still have it. Yay. Of course, this monument's in the middle of the battlefield. It was Andrew Jackson Houston who helped get the appropriated funds to finish the monument. Look at that beautiful star. How many of you been to the San Jacinto Monument? Oh, we need a field trip. It cost $1.5 million. Look when it opened, April 21st, 1939. And this is why Fiesta started. The Battle of Flowers Parade is Fiesta is always in April because we're honoring San Jacinto Day. So our roots for Fiesta go back to our Texas history and the Battle of San Jacinto. I love what Margaret wrote in her Bible about Sam when he died. I'm going to read it. It's here. He died on the 26th of July, 1863. General Sam Houston, the beloved and affectionate husband, father, devoted patriot, the fearless soldier, the meek and lowly Christian. I find that interesting. Okay. So, Margaret, what happened to her? She was left with a small amount of cash, a good bit of land. She wound up moving to Independence, Texas. Have you ever been to Independence, Texas? It's a wide spot in the road. She died about 4 years later of a yellow fever epidemic that came through, and she was laid to rest in the little community of Independence. Sam was buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Huntsville. They were not together. They are not together to this day. They're separated in burial. Sam said this in 1841, and I love this quote, and I'll conclude this morning with this. Texas has achieved her entire independence and successfully asserted her right to a position amidst the nations of the earth. How has this been accomplished? By the spirit and energy of her citizens, by the valor of her sons, and by the inspired language of patriotism by her daughters. This is 2022, and whether you know it or not, the spirit of Sam Houston lives in the heart of every Texan today. And the things he did affect who we are to this day. In Texas, he was a great Texan and a great American. The story of the incomparable Sam Houston. And this year, we're celebrating the 186th anniversary of the Battle of San Jacinto. San Jacinto, these are the answers to your prediction, adventure questions. Reverend Dr. Moore, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure presenting to you today. Thank you. My pleasure. I did not. No. Adobe Walls. You're a very historic church. Yeah. Oh. Thank. Oh, thank you. My goodness. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.